Ми представува особена чест и задоволство да го отворам овој наш денешен настан по повод одбележувањето на Светскиот ден на логиката. Значи, ова е второ одбележување на Светскиот ден на логиката, што го организираат Институтот за филозофија при Филозофскиот факултет науки во Скопје и Филозофското друштво на Македонија, и се надеваме дека ќе биде почеток на една убава и долготрена традиција. Може би голем дел од колешките и колегите што се денес со нас на настанот веќе знаат дека станува збор за еден ден што е прокламиран, значи како одбележување на Светскиот ден на логиката, World Logic Day, е прокламиран на 26 ноември 2019 година од страна на УНЕСКО, и дека од тогаш традиционално се одбележува ширум светот на овој датум 14 јануари, а целта на овој светски ден е да се подигне свеста како на научните заедници, така и на пошироката публика за интелектуалната историја, за практичните импликации и концептуалното значење на логиката. Според сајтот на УНЕСКО, целта на ова светско одбележување на денот на логиката е унапредување на меѓународната соработка, промовирање на развојот на логиката во истражувачките и во наставните институции и поддршка на универзитетите и другите институции што имаат дејност поврзана со логиката. Исто така, целта е и да се унапреди и разбирањето за значењето на логиката и нејзините импликации за науката, технологијата и иновациите. Прославувањето на Светскиот ден на логиката, според УНЕСКО, може да придонесе и за промовирање на културата на мирот, диалогот и земното разбирање, засновано врз унапредувањето на образованието и на науката. Ми представува особена чест денес накусо да ја представам професорката Радмила Јовановиќ Козловски, која што љубезно се одзва на нашата покана да одржи предавање по повод Светскиот ден на логиката, бидејќи тоа е форматот кој што за сега сметаме дека е најпогоден да го одбележиме овој светски ден. Иако основните информации за неа веќе ги имавте во мејловите и во другите текстови со кои што се одбележуваше настанот, јас сакам уште еднаш да соопштам, да споделам некои основни биографски податоци за неа. Инаку, таа е доцентка на Одделението за филозофија на Филозофскиот факултет во Универзитетот во Белград. Радмила, слободно коригирај ме ако нешто не е адекватно. Значи, до дипломските студии по филозофија ги завршува на Белградскиот универзитет, магистрира на Универзитетот Шарл де Гол Лил 3 во Лил, а нејзината докторска дисертација е изработена и одбранета во рамките на една програма за котютел, односно за заеднички докторски студии на Универзитетот во Белград и Универзитетот Шарл де Гол во Лил. Исто така, од меѓу нејзините истражувачки интереси во филозофијата се историјата на филозофијата, метафизиката, филозофијата на јазикот, логиката, филозофијата на математиката и сродните подрачја. Таа е член и на интеруниверзитетската мрежа ОФРЕС, франкофонската организација за образование и истражување во хуманистичките науки, како и член на уредничкиот одбор на списанието Теорија во издание на Српското филозофско друштво. Добитник е на голем број стипендии за научно исовршување, како од страна на институциите во Србија, така и од меѓународни институции, а исто така би сакала меѓу нејзините научни публикации да ја истакнам книгата што 2015 година ја објавува во College Publications во Лондон, Hintika Stake on Realism and the Constructivist Challenge. Така што, реков уште еднаш се заблагодарувам за соработката што ја имаме до сега. Таа неколку пати, беше присутна и на меѓународната недела на Филозофскиот факултет, еднаш како предавач, друг пат како гостин, и во духот на продолжувањето на таа соработка, се надевам дека и денес ќе имаме една продуктивна дискусија на темите што не поврзуваат, особено пошироката сфера на филозофијата, а особено именно од подрачјето на логиката. Радмила повели, значи само да кажам за нашиот аудиториум, дека предавањето ќе биде на англиски јазик, меѓутоа дискусијата ќе реализираме така како што сметаме дека е најсоодветно. Значи, ако сакате повеќе прашањата да ги поставите на македонски, можеме да одиме и така, па ќе видиме дали има потреба од превод во поглед на стручната терминологија. Повели Радмила, екранот е твој.
Okay, thank you so much, Anna, for this lovely presentation, and thank you for the invitation. I'm always happy to speak for publics in Skopje, either live or online, and it is my pleasure to participate in the World's Day of Logic. As I said before, the subject of this talk is the theory of meaning of Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz from the early 30s of the 20th century. Now, usually we associate the idea of rule following with Wittgenstein, obviously, but it is less known that Ajdukiewicz came to a very similar idea and apparently completely independently about in the same period. Both actually came to this idea in the early 30s of the 20th century. Now, in this talk, first part will be consecrated to the presentation of this so-called directival theory of meaning, the meaning theory based on a specific view of language as a rule-following activity. And I will say a bit more about the place it occupies in general in larger Ajdukiewicz theory and how he used this theory of meaning in the first period of his work to defend the position of radical conventionalism. Then I will present one critique that put forward one Polish philosopher, Tadeusz Czarnecki. He is analyzing two papers from both philosophers, Wittgenstein and Ajdukiewicz, both published in 1934. And he claims that actually both approaches to meaning were obviously made in view to assure intersubjectivity of meaning, or objectivity of meaning, maybe a little bit stronger word. But he claims that while Wittgenstein's approach is coping good with that goal, and Wittgenstein has the means in his theory to assure intersubjectivity, that it is not the case with Ajdukiewicz approach. So he is criticizing Ajdukiewicz theory of meaning. In the third part of this talk, I will answer to this critique, and I will argue that this critique is not is not accurate. Actually, the interpretation of Ajdukiewicz theory is not accurate. I will argue that actually Czarnecki neglected some important parts of conventionalist position that actually Ajdukiewicz adopted. So I think that his critique is misplaced. So I will start by saying a few words about Ajdukiewicz. I understood that you know a lot about him already, but he was obviously a distinguished member of Lwów-Warsaw School, a famous Polish philosopher and logician. Lwów-Warsaw School was founded by Kazimierz Twardowski in 1895, and many big names appeared and passed through that school and collaborated with the school, as Łukasiewicz, Kortabinski, Czyżewski, Ajdukiewicz, and obviously Tarski. And the school functioned until the beginning of Second World War, where most of them actually fled under the Nazis' occupation. The philosophical work of Ajdukiewicz can be divided in three phases. In the first phase, in 30s, he defended, as I said, a position of radical conventionalism. Then in the second period, he gravitated towards some kind of moderated empiricism to finish until the end of his career with the extreme, we may say, radical empiricism. So it was a long journey. However, his theory of meaning, he formulated in the first period, in 30s, and he actually never abandoned it. He only changed the details about the meaning rules and the attitude towards some of them, but he actually stuck to this theory of meaning until the end. So in his period, in the first period where he defended radical conventionalism, he was under the clear influence of French school, we may say, with Poincaré, Leroy, Diem, and so on. Not only that his position was a radicalization of Poincaré's conventionalism, but it was also defended in a new manner. Basically, Ajdukević defended this conventionalism with the arguments based on semantics, and that had some repercussions on his kind of conventionalism. Now, it is commonplace, obviously, that this big turn in Wittgenstein's philosophy also happened in early 30s, when he abandoned his views, early views from Tractatus, and he came up with a new idea of meaning based on actually that this idea was also that language is kind of a rule following activity, and the meaning should be related to language games where some implicit rules are present. His full theory was spelled out later, obviously in philosophical investigations, but already in 30s, actually the brown book and the blue book appears, where he already actually adopts this new view of meaning. As I said before, Ajdukević at the same period developed his idea independently, but the theory of Ajdukević was much less influential, probably because the influence of Tarski was too strong in the Lvov-Warsaw school. That's at least my opinion. His ideas, Ajdukević published in papers Meaning and Language, and the World Picture and the Conceptual Operators in 34. And then later in 35, another paper was published, The Scientific World Perspective. And there he explains his radical conventionalist position and his meaning theory. So his meaning theory was basically built up to defend the position of radical conventionalism, but it was actually interesting on its own. It was one of the first, actually with Wittgenstein, the first idea of meaning that was completely non-referential, contrary to the approaches of Frege, Russell, Tarski, later Kripke, and so on. It shares some important features with Wittgenstein's philosophy. The idea that meaning is in use, the idea of impossibility of the language for isolated individuals, the idea of conceptual operators that is related to a certain language, and which bring us to something that Ajdukević calls the world view. And that shares a lot of similarities, I think, with the form of life which exists in Wittgenstein's philosophy. According to this approach to meaning, obviously the main carrier of meaning is a sentence, and meanings are formed inside of certain communities, certain group of people sharing the same language. Now, the meanings so formed in a community are basis for so-called meaning rules. Meaning rules are rules for accepting sentences in a given language. Basically, the communication normally among us is flowing without interruptions. Normally, we communicate with each other, we understand each other, and we rarely question if somebody understood us, unless we are speaking about some complicated matters. But sometimes it happens that communication breaks down. There are some misunderstanding, we may say. And that's why meaning rules are important according to Ajdukević. They represent kind of semantical tests for interlocutors. Do they use the expressions of the language in the same manner? And Ajdukević put forward three kinds of rules. First are axiomatic meaning rules. They ask a person to unconditionally accept the axioms of a given language. For example, A is A. That concerns obviously formal languages like logic and mathematics. Then we have deductive meaning rules. They ask a person to unconditionally accept the pairs of sentences which are deductively connected. Obviously, the first example would be modus ponens. If A then B, given that A then B. And third kind of rules, which are the most intriguing, are empirical meaning rules. They ask a person to accept sentences with empirical content if that person is exposed to some experience, to some experiential data. For example, if I put an ice cube on the hand of somebody, I expect that person to say it is cold, right? And the empirical rules actually demands from that person to say it is cold. Otherwise, she's breaking the specification of meaning in the language. Now, the important thing to know this is that actually it is not meaning rules who are determining the meaning. It is the other way around. Actually, meaning rules are defined through the meanings which are previously constituted through use inside of a language community. So those rules, I repeat, serves as some kind of semantical tests in the communication. Those meaning rules have their domains. The domain of the axiomatic meaning rules will be the set of axioms of a given language. Domain of deductive meaning rules would be ordered pair of sentences which are deductively connected. And the domain of empirical meaning rules are ordered pairs of experiences and sentences, right? Now, all those domains of meaning rules determine something that Ajdukević calls the matrix of the language. The matrix of the language has its structure, obviously, and that is important. The meaning of the expressions are determined in the matrix of language through the place they are occupying in the structure of the language matrix. So meanings are determined in a very abstract manner through the place they are occupying in the structure. That allows Ajdukević to define synonymity. Defining synonymity means defining the meaning, right? The sameness of meaning. So two expressions are synonymous if they can exchange the place in the matrix of language without changing the domain of meaning rules. And that is the way that Ajdukević approaches the meaning. Now we can see how this description of meaning served to Ajdukević to defend his position of radical conventionalism. Further, Ajdukević defines two kinds of, he gives two divisions of languages. He defines open language and closed language, and connected and disconnected language. Basically, open language is the language that can still be enriched with the new meaning, with new meanings. And closed language would be the language that could not be enriched with new meanings, or complete language. On the other hand, language is connected if it cannot be divided in two sets, such that no expression from one set is meaning connected with any expression from the other set. Otherwise, the language is disconnected. Now, obviously, if you think about it, natural languages are opened and disconnected. But Ajdukević considered scientific theories as certain languages. And he says that an ideal scientific language is closed and connected. And here comes his radical conventionalist thesis. We can have two scientific theories, meaning two closed and connected languages that are concerning the same domain of experience, but they are mutually not translatable. This is the radicalization of Poincaré's position. But it is a bit different because Poincaré was conventionalist only when it comes to geometry and fundamental physics and nothing more, not arithmetics, not experimental physics. Further on, Poincaré says that axioms and postulates of geometry are pure conventions, and it doesn't make sense to ask about the truth value of those axioms and postulates. It is not like that in Ajdukević, because those axioms are true relatively to the chosen language. That will be important in my talk later on, and I will remind you of that fact. Now, second part, the critique offered by Czarnecki. Now, Czarnecki is attacking actually the formulation of empirical meaning rules in Ajdukević's theory. He says that actually it is defined in such a manner that it renders impossible to assure the intersubjectivity of meanings when it comes to the sentences about external objects. He analyzes, as I said, Wittgenstein's Blue Book, published in 1934, and Ajdukević's paper, Language and Meaning, also published in 1934. Now, let's see one example that Ajdukević gives of empirical meaning rules. He says, imagine this situation. There is a person who is on the dentist chair, and the dentist accidentally touches the nerve in the tooth of the patient. Very unpleasant situation. The person starts screaming and crying. And then the dentist asks, does it hurt? The meaning rule obliges the person to accept the sentence, it hurts. Otherwise, we would think either that the person is lying, either that she is simply not using the expression it hurts in the same manner as the rest of the language community does, right? Now, Czarnecki see in that definition, in that example, three elements. The fact that the nerve was touched by a dentist, the feeling of pain, and third, the acceptance by the person of the phrase, it hurts. And according to Czarnecki's analysis, the problem is that Ajdukević puts all the emphasis on the feeling of pain. While behavioral characteristics, the screaming of the person, crying, play at most secondary role. However, the feeling of pain is somebody's private affair. No, we cannot feel other people's pain. We cannot experience other people's mental states, inner states. So, according to Czarnecki, the fact that the empirical rules are defined through the pair experience sentence renders actually virtually impossible to pass to the statements about external objects, where we want to assure intersubjectivity of meaning. Most of our empirical sentences are not concerning our inner states. They are concerning external objects. We want to speak about tables, books, and so on. Another problematical aspect of this theory, according to Czarnecki, is that those meaning rules are defined through acceptance and refusal of a certain individual. Now, the idea that Ajdukević had is that those psychological categories, accepting and refusing, can be actually replaced with logical categories when we consider the logical elements of judgment. They would be replaced by affirmation and negation. But Czarnecki thinks that this passage is barely impossible because of the way that empirical meaning rules are conceived. On the other hand, Wittgenstein in his Blue Book has much stronger demand of intersubjectivity. Wittgenstein also speaks about empirical sentences, and though they can always be refuted, obviously, he, however, gives the means of their justification, and he gives two kinds of means to justify empirical sentences. So he differentiates between criteria and symptoms. And he says that when we are using criteria, we are justifying in a necessary manner our empirical statements. While when we are offering symptoms, we are justifying our empirical sentences only contingently. Here is the Wittgenstein's example from the Blue Book. A patient is at the doctor's, and the doctor says, this patient has angina. Now, he has two ways of justify this empirical sentence. If he just looks at the throat of the patient and see that it is reddish, and he says it is angina, it is only contingent justification. It is a symptom. But if he performs tests and he finds in the laboratory that there are some bacteria in this person's throat, I don't know, streptococcus or whatever, then he gives a criteria that it is actually angina. So he's necessarily justifying his empirical statement. Why? Well, because that is the very definition of angina. Defining empirical terms is connected to criteria. To say that this person has angina because bacteria are found in his throat is nothing more than to define what angina is. Of course, even that empirical sentence can be refuted. It can happen, for example, that they made a mistake in a laboratory, so the results were not good. However, this is what Wittgenstein thinks of justifying empirical sentences. A point of Czarnecki is that criteria in Wittgenstein's philosophy are always something objective, something external, something available for observation by many people, and never somebody's inner state. Wittgenstein was against ostensive definitions when it came to inner states, and it is famous his phrase from philosophical investigations: inner process stands in need of outer criteria. Like we never point to our inner states. We always should point to behavioral characteristics, behavior of other people. When it comes to empirical sentences.
Се извинувам, само ве молам другите нека ги имаат што не зборуваат микрофоните исклучено, бидејќи имаме некоја фонија и интерферира со тоа што го зборува предавачката. Благодарам многу. I think that the problem resolved, so we can continue. Thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much.
Yes. So Wittgenstein had a lot to say about pain, and he was always to speak about the pain starting from the outer behavior, not from the inner state. So Czarnecki concludes that Wittgenstein has in his philosophical arsenal, as I said, the means to assure intersubjectivity of meaning, while Ajdukević cannot do. And now the third part, where I will try to argue against what Czarnecki said. First, I want to point to one distinction that Ajdukević made between simple and compound empirical meaning rules. And this is the distinction that Czarnecki does mention at some point, but he somehow, I think, neglects the importance of it. Within empirical meaning rules, Ajdukević differentiates between simple and compound meaning rules. In simple meaning rules, we do indeed have the pairs of perceptions and sentences, like in the example with the pain. I agree that example with the pain is maybe ill-chosen, because pain is so specific even among inner states, because it points to nothing outside. It is completely, it is different, it is not intentional, and so on. That's why I used another example. I used the example of the ice cube and the phrase it's cold. But however it be, we have more than just simple empirical rules. Because of the fact that most of our empirical statements are about external objects, Ajdukević is actually introducing compound meaning rules. This is what he says about them. We distinguish two kinds of empirical rules of meaning, simple and compound. An empirical rule of meaning is called simple if it, in case it declares only that person does not violate the meaning specification of a language who is prepared to accept such and such a sentence upon experiencing such and such a perception. An empirical meaning rule is called compound in case it requests a readiness to accept such and such a sentence upon the fulfillment of certain conditions, including inter alia, the experiencing of such and such a perception. I underline this phrase, I think it is important. The certain conditions, including inter alia, experiencing of such and such a perception. And I will try further on in my talk to specify what those conditions are, in my opinion. I continue with the quote. The totality of such conditions, together with individual perceptions, we term data of experience. These can comprise, for example, perceptions and inarticulated judgments by which a situation is interpreted as normal. I think that what Czarnecki neglected to say it a bit up front is that this definition of data of experience, which is more complex than what he took for it for in the beginning. I think that basically another component that is needed, these conditions apart from inter alia such and such perceptions, at least in my interpretation, is a new component, and that is ontological commitments to existence of certain objects and certain characteristics and features of those objects, which is read from the non-articulated judgments where situation is interpreted as normal. The example, if I say the sentence, this is the table, when I'm pointing to the table that is in front of me, I actually oblige myself ontologically, I commit myself ontologically to the existence of certain objects called tables. And I claim that this in front of me is a table. The meaning of the expression is determined by conceptual apparatus connected to my language that I share with my language community. If the situation is normal, then this phrase will be true, right? If situation is not normal, like in the case of dream or hallucination, this phrase will be false. Now, I want to defend the thesis that this interpretation of directival theory of meaning offered by Czarnecki is misplaced, because it actually is in conflict with the radical conventionalist position that Ajdukević adopted. According to this radical conventionalist position, our knowledge of the world cannot ever be completely determined by experience. And that is the basis of conventionalist position. In this essential manner, our knowledge about the external world depends on the conceptual apparatus and the language we are using. So the paper, the world picture and the conceptual apparatus, Ajdukević starts with this thesis. Of all the judgments which we accept and which accordingly constitute our entire world picture, none is unambiguously determined by experiential data. Every one of them depends on the conceptual apparatus we choose to use in representing experiential data. We can choose, however, one or another conceptual apparatus which will affect our whole world picture. And the paper is concluded by the following. Our world picture consists rather in just the meaning of expressions, and in this, experiential data are not contained. The world picture is constructed entirely of abstract elements. The role of perceptual data consists only in this. The conceptual apparatus haven't already been selected. In terms of it, perceptual data determine which of the elements in the conceptual apparatus are to enter the world picture. Those quotes are showing that actually Czarnecki in his interpretation turned completely the order that Ajdukević held to. We do not start from simple perceptions to come to empirical claims about external objects. It is rather the other way around. This interpretation of Ajdukević actually pushes him very far into empiricist camp. What Czarnecki does basically in his critique, he evokes the traditional epistemological problem, how we can pass from simple inner perceptions to knowledge about external objects, how we can bridge this gap between the inner states and which is available only to one subject and the objective world which is available to everybody. And the oldest philosophical problem, how do we even know that the world exists? From that, he passes to the challenge of intersubjectivity of sentences about external objects. But radical conventionalism is actually the position according to which we can have different languages describing our world and different conceptual apparatus related to those languages. So our experiential data are basically interpreted on the basis of this, and meanings are preceding them. Ontological questions like the existence of the external world and intersubjectivity of sentences concerning the meaning of sentences concerning the external objects are actually relativized to the chosen language, and epistemological problems can only be resolved by studying the semantics of the given language. And Ajdukević says about a philosopher epistemologist, philosopher must be a realist, and he has to join scientists in claim that trees, houses, mountains, etc. exist, understanding this claim quite literally, like it is understood by scientists using this object language. So natural language we are using, as well as scientific language, there contain the statement about the external objects, and their meaning is determined by the place they are occupying in the structure, in the matrix of language. Even though alternative conceptual operators are always possible in the alternative description of the reality, once we adopt a certain language and certain conceptual operators, then we are committed, we are ontologically committed to existence of certain objects. That very much reminds of the position of crime, of course. And it was remarked by many interprets of Ajdukević. Svetski argues that this is, in ontological sense, the position of ontological deflationalism, the one that Price is ascribing to crime. We are using adequately the expressions, and our sentences are true when the situation is interpreted as normal. This is what Ajdukević says about that. In uttering his object language statements, the author observes, among other things, empirical rules. He is prepared, for example, to assert the sentence, "This table is round," on the basis of what he perceives right now. He also accepts the basic postulates of ontology, and consequently, from the above sentence, he is prepared to deduce the sentence tables exist. Now we can see what this additional component, this additional element is in the compound empirical rules. The meaning of the expression concerning the external objects is determined by the public use of those expressions inside of a community sharing the same conceptual operators. The choice of language is dictating our ontological obligations, our ontological commitments, and their characteristics. Is that expression adequately used will depend on the context in which it is uttered, and from bunch of other hypotheses connected to this expression. Here is what Ajdukević gives as an example. One uses the word table as an expression of English. If one is prepared to accept certain sentences of English in which table occurs, and if one is prepared to accept them on the basis of some motives rather than others. If, when using table, I am prepared to accept sentence like, "A table is a piece of furniture, one takes meals at the table," and so on. And if, besides, I am prepared to accept the sentence, "This is the table," on the basis of certain intuitive presentations, then I am using table as an expression of English language. So empirical rules are basically determined through accepting and refutal of certain sentences from part of certain person, certain individual. And that is another point of critiques that Charnetsky is offering. But actually, when it comes to the meaning, then individual becomes irrelevant, because meaning is determined as the place of the structure the expression occupies in the language matrix. Then affirmation and negation as the elements of logical judgments can indeed replace psychological categories like accepting and refusing. I think that Charnetsky is actually neglected this point in his critique. According to his approach, it seems like the meaning rules are themselves actually dictated I'm sorry, on the other way around. It seems like meanings are dictated by meaning rules, but it is actually the other way around. Meanings are pre-existing, and they are determined in non-referential manner, meaning also in non-ostensive manner. Then only later on, as a consequence of meaning pre-existing, we can determine what are the meaning rules in a given language. When it comes to logic and mathematics, those meaning rules will be only axiomatic and deductive meaning rules. When it comes to natural sciences or natural language, we will also have to include the empirical meaning rules. So if my interpretation of Ajkjević is accurate, which I believe it is, then the critique of Czarnecki is misplaced. Thank you. That is my talk.
Thank you very much, Radmila, for this very precise, very informative, and yet very inspiring lecture, at least to my sense. So it was very nice to hear about those aspects of the semantic theory of Kazimierz Ajkjević, who, as you already mentioned, was one of the most prominent representative of the Slavoj Varšav school, who which was not very, active for a very long time, but leaves very deep and important traces in the logic of the 20th century, and still inspiring research and discussions. So as it was already mentioned in the beginning, now we have some room, some space left for discussion, and I invite the members of the public, of our colleague that assisted to your lecture, to share their reflections, comments, questions, etc. So I think that we will have also very productive and inspiring discussion too. Дали некој, so are there any questions? So please either just signal you wish to discuss something or to ask some question by raising the hand mark on the screen, or just turn on your micro and enter the discussion directly. Let me see if... Okay.
Ајде, ја да се јавам, да не се застрамиш, да не те застрамат.
Благодарам. Ете, Љубомир Гајдов ќе го стрши мразот и ќе отвори дискусијата. We have an icebreaker, so our colleague Љубомир Гајдов, please.
Поштована професорке, када истражуемо развој Ajkjević Kazimierza, можемо да видимо да се он бави главно са 4 основни issues, ствари, проблема. Он е за теоријом значења, са негових 3 основних есеја: Meaning of Expression, Language and Meaning, Problem of Empirism and Concept of Meaning, дао фундамент за ову негову дедуктивну теорiju која се бави на логичком основи синтаксе. Меđutim, šta мислите, дали би он могу да данас, кад ја експлозија вештачке интелигенције и неуронауке, могу да оде дупле, иако у првом мом наступу сам реко да е он побего од своје, да не кажем, генијалне теорije значења после увода, после критике, негов колеге Тарског.
Hvala vam puno na ovom pitanju. Ja ću malo razviti. Ja se nadam da se na srpskom razumemo ili je na engleskom.
Nažalost, moj majčin jezik je srpski.
Čujem to.
Мислам дека нема проблем да повели Радмила, мислам дека ќе се разбереме. Ако од публиката има, особено од помладите наши колешки и колеги.
Ја ќе им преведувам.
Да, ете така, благодарам. Повели Радмила, можеш наставити.
Hvala vam puno na ovoj dopuni. Generalno, zapravo Ajdukević nije odustao potpuno od svoje teorije značenja, ali je kada je prešao na radikalni empirizam na kraju svoje karijere, on je odbacio aksiomatska i deduktivna pravila i zapravo je smatrao da jedina prava pravila jesu empirijska, ali pristup zadržava, pristup značenju preko pravila značenja, to zadržava. Sad, zašto je odustao od svoje pozicije radikalnog konvencionalizma, vi ste tu potpuno u pravu, to je jedna interesantna stvar, malo istorijski delikatesa, ako hoćete. Tarski je došao i rekao je Ajdukeviću, ova tvoja teorija bi dozvolila da dva izraza u jeziku budu sinonimna, a da imaju različitu referenciju. Zamislite jezik formalni u kome postoje dva aksioma, A nije jednako B i B nije jednako A. Šta oni govore? Pa govore upravo da ta dva izraza imaju različitu referencu. Međutim, ta dva izraza mogu slobodno da zamene mesta u strukturi, u matrici jezika, tako da su po definiciji Ajdukevića oni sinonimi. I to je Tarski smatrao za nedopustivo i Ajdukević je to prihvatio, da ne mogu dva sinonimna izraza da imaju različitu referenciju i zato je odustao od svoje pozicije radikalnog konvencionalizma. U neku ruku to jeste čudno, vi ste potpuno u pravu. Čudno je zato što je ta njegova teorija značenja od samog početka imala zadatak da bude nereferencijalna teorija značenja, pa onda je malo čudno da je odustao od nje zbog jedne primedbe koja se tiče referencije same. S druge strane, ja se slažem da je taj radikalni konvencionalizam bio interesantan. Ono što je drugi problem sa njim, zbog čega je malo teže sada braniti takvu teoriju, to je što ne postoji de facto ni jedan takav zatvoreni i povezani jezik o kome govori Ajdukević. To je jedna velika idealizacija i zaista u nauci zapravo nemamo takve jezike, pa onda to zvuči pomalo kao prazna teza na kraju. Međutim, postoje danas pokušaj da se ta teorija brani. Naprimjer, Pavel Grabarčik je objavio pre par godina, mislim 2017, ako se ne varam, jednu knjigu u kojoj brani direktivnu teoriju značenja i pokušava da poboljša Ajdukevićevu teoriju da može i dalje da se brani u ovom obliku izvora. Sad ono drugo po čemu je zapravo Ajdukević najpoznatiji jeste da je on otac kategorijalne gramatike i on je to učinio 35. godine, jako rano, sve do 50 i neke nije bilo nikakvih pomaka, odnosno ta teorija je bila potpuno zanemarena. 55. prvi neki znaci interesovanja se pojavljuju, da bi tek 70. godina teorija zaista počela da cveta i cveta sve do danas. Danas je jako bitna. I bitna je u kontekstu ovoga što ste rekli, veštačke inteligencije i tako dalje. I tekako se zapravo koristi. Što se tiče samog pristupa značenju kroz sleđenje pravila, to je ideja koja je zajednička Wittgensteinu i Ajdukeviću i ona se pokazuje kao vrlo plodna. Naprimjer, danas znamo da Google Translate zapravo funkcioniše u velikoj meri po Wittgensteinovim pravilima i da je u velikoj meri Wittgensteinom inspirisana. Kao što vidimo, radi sve bolje i bolje. Danas imamo još bolje prevode možda od Google Translate, ali svakako da su ove ideje nisu uopšte bile nešto jalovo. Retko se dešava da filozofske ideje zapravo imaju praktičnu primenu. Evo, ovo su neki slučajevi gde je to zapravo, gde se to desilo.
Ali mogu da produžim?
Naravno.
I kažem Ajdukević i Wittgenstein, bez obzira što na prvi pogled izgleda da se razlikuju, se pod uticajem Fregeja, koji je prvi napravio, kao što znamo, predikativni račun. A Frege je uticao i na moga učitelja Rasela, koji isto, ko vi, predavao meni filozofiju matematike. Da li mislite da je uticaj Fregeja na Ajdukevića i na Wittgensteina bilo jedan korak napred u razvoju matematičke logike?
Apsolutno i bez ikakve dileme. Teško je preceniti značaj Frega i Rasela. Kad se radi o Wittgensteinu, jedna interesantna činjenica jeste da Wittgenstein bio jedan dosta nezgodan čovek, to je opšte poznato, i nije mnogo mario za kolege i za druge filozofe, ali jedan filozof koga je uvek cenio i koga je neverovatno voleo je bio Russell. U stvari jedan od retkih koga je on trpeo. I poznato je bilo jedno predavanje koje se odigralo u Londonu, koje je držao Wittgenstein i koje nije hteo da započne zato što nije video Russella u publici. Russell je bio pozvan i trebalo da dođe. Čekao ga jedno 2 sata, dok oni su na kraju zvali i molili Russella da dođe, da bio Wittgenstein pred tolikim ogromnim auditorijumom, jer je tad bi bio već jako poznat. U tome auditorijumu su bila sva velika imena tadašnja, i Popper i ne znam da drugi. I Russell je na kraju pristao da tu dođe, da bi Wittgenstein uopšte održao to predavanje. Tako da to je jedna mala anegdota filozofska, ali govori o značaju koji je zapravo Wittgenstein pripisivao Russellu. Naravno, bez tog preokreta u logici koji je Frege napravio, i ne samo Frege, takođe Dedekind u matematici i tako dalje, mi ne bismo danas ni imali formalnu logiku. Ona prethodna logika je bila aristotelovska logika. To je jedan veliki preokret u logici i matematici i teško je preceniti značaj toga. Naravno, takođe uticaj na Labovsku-Varšavsku školu. Ja sam rekla da je Judkević bio pod uticajem francuske škole, ali nisam bila sasvim pravedna. Naravno da je uticaj i Beča i nemačkih filozofa bio jako veliki.
Još samo jednu malu dopunu, da ne budem nevaspitan. Kad ste počeli sa dosetkama, ja sam sa Russellom često igrao šah. U jednom momentu mi je pričao kako je došao do njega Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein je bio apsolvent na mašinskom fakultetu u Beču i bio je megaloman, teo je da napravi prvi u svetu kao bankarov sin jumbo jet, ali nije mogao da reši problem matematičkog modela Elise. Šeto je po svima mašinskim fakultetima po Evropi i na kraju su mu rekli to može da vam pomogne samo Lord Russell. On je došao kod Russella i slušao predavanje i kaže, profesoro, ništa ne razumem, svi kažu da sam genije, a ja ništa ne razumem. On kaže, gledajte, nisam ja prorok pa da vidim koliko ste pametne, napišite jedan esej pa ću da vam kažem da li ste za ovde ili niste za ovde, pošto ja predajem filozofiju matematike. Ovaj se mučio, doneo jedan papir i Russell je samo video prvu rečenicu i zaklopio je. Kaže, znači ja sam, kaže, idiot. Ne, vi ste genije stvarno i ja ću da budem vaš student. On je rekao svom studentu.
Da, to jeste čuvena anegdota, takođe čula sam je već sjajne su te anegdote o Wittgensteinu i Russellu, ima ih podosta. Hvala vam za ovo.
Vama hvala.
Благодарам многу. Колега Тигор Поптрајков, па разговор, повелете.
I have 2 questions. First question is about relativity. Was the relativity the fact that inspired you for this lecture or presentation? Because I think relativization of the meaning is indeed, unfortunately, the big currently in our contemporaneity is a big problem, and they blame relativization of everything, let's say, for the fall down of the academic discourses and entirely progressiveness. But so I wanted to ask about the relativization, and because I think that if we entirely exclude relativization from interpretation, then we'll stay without, again, we'll be in a blind passage, because we'll stay without inspiration and without meaning, actually, because if we don't relativize the terms and the empiristic conclusions, which can also be wrong, then I think we are not the real academics. And the second question is the connection with psychology, because you said what is the connection of psychology with Wittgenstein and Ajdukiewicz, because Wittgenstein has big comments about psychology, and you said that if we feel like this, then this term, this discourse may not be this way. So I think that he's not into psychology, but I think that Wittgenstein doesn't entirely exclude psychology. I think he's more of like John Searle. He considers it. So thank you.
Благодарам. Игор, Радмила, please.
Thank you so much for these questions. Actually, yes, the meaning is relativized to a given language in Ajdukiewicz. In Wittgenstein, it is relativized to the certain form of life we are sharing among each other. Point is that there is, actually, it's not a complete relativization of meaning inside of a community who is sharing the same language games, as Wittgenstein would say. We communicate perfectly, and there is no problem in there is not such a relativity of meaning. However, it is true that meanings are not so fixed as it was thought before. But already Frege noticed this naivety of the position that as Quine described it, people understood meaning as we are walking in some museum, and the words were etiquettes under statues and pictures. It's not like that. Meanings are not fixed once and forever. They are developing in the community, and they are developing inside in the communication. That is the point of Wittgenstein and Ajdukiewicz. Meaning is in use. Naturally, that leads us to the position where meanings are not so fixed once and for all. But that doesn't mean that everything is relative and that we cannot communicate. Quite on the contrary. I defended in Lille, like Anna said, I gave a talk in Lille that was more focused on Wittgenstein. And there I defended that he was not such an anti-realist that is it usually supposed. He was interpreted by Kripke as a hardcore anti-realist. I don't think that was the case. I think that meanings are assured. Intersubjectivity of meaning is assured, but those meanings are not fixed once and for all. That's why I'm not speaking about objectivity of meaning, but intersubjectivity. That is concerning the first question. And about the second question, yes, both of them obviously attached quite a bit of interest and importance to psychological categories. Wittgenstein is speaking a lot about it. A big part of philosophical investigations concerns pain and inner psychological states. Only he doesn't think that the meanings of the term pain and other psychological terms, he does not mean that it includes referring to somebody's actual inner states. He explains that with the metaphor of beetles in the box. Like if all of us had one little box with a beetle inside, but we cannot see each other's beetles. That is everybody's pain, this little beetle that everybody has in his own box. But Wittgenstein says the language game concerning pain would be played the same if all the beetles are the same, or if they're all different, or even if some boxes were empty. So he says the game of pain is playing concerning the box, which is something external, our behavior, basically. So he thinks that the meaning of the term pain is constructed through behavioral characteristics that we all can see and share. Doesn't mean that pain is nothing. Pain is definitely something, we all feel pain. But the meaning of the term pain is not determined by what everybody personally feels. That's about Wittgenstein. When it comes to Ajdukiewicz, he starts with those psychological categories, accepting, refusing, etc. But what he really wants is to say that meaning is eventually determined in a very abstract manner through the structures, through the metrics of language. So logic should, in our logical analysis, completely replace those psychological categories. When it comes to meanings, it is not actually relevant, even though meaning rules are defined in such a manner. And that is why, because actually meaning rules serve in communication as semantical tests. So this psychological component has to be taken in consideration. That's how I see it for both philosophers.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Radmila, very much. Thank you, Igor, too. Are there other questions, comments, demands for clarification, or other thoughts to share? Okay, yeah. If not, I would like to ask Radmila a question myself, but given the fact that we already had a very precise, very, say, professional questions raised, very up to the point regarding the subject of your lecture, I would like to a bit broaden the topic of our discussion, go in maybe even in a more personal aspects related to the general meaning of logic and as an occasion to celebrate the World Logic of Philosophy. So from your bio, we could see that you have a pretty wide interest in philosophical topics, which include history of philosophy, metaphysics, and other areas, but still your specialization is on the area of logic and philosophy of mathematics. So I would invite you to share in a very informal way, like between friends, your, I mean, the essence, what you perceive as the essence of your drive to logic and to philosophy of mathematics, and especially the relation of these fields with other philosophical areas, and the use and importance of those tools, of this conceptual apparatus that is developed in the framework of logic, applied to those other fields, but also maybe not only to comment on the practical use of logic as tool and instruments for dealing all kinds of philosophical questions, but also what you perceive to be the inherent philosophical significance of this area. If you would like, I mean, just an invitation to share.
Thank you. Well, it's not an easy question.
Yes, I know. I'm struggling with it myself, but just some thoughts, not.
Yeah, here's the first thing that comes to my mind. My approach to philosophy was always problem-oriented. I never worked. I mean, now I'm speaking about Wittgenstein and Tukiewicz, but I never just took one philosopher to study. There are some colleagues who are doing that. I appreciate that enormously, because then you have a work already done on many philosophers, and I'm not capable of reading all those very long books for a very long period of time. So my approach is rather I take a problem and then I work on it from different aspects. Usually the problems that mostly interest me are actually from of metaphysical nature, and one of the fascinating things for me are metaphysical problems related to mathematics. Basically, the existence of number, the nature of mathematical entities, and so on. That was probably my first love in a philosophical sense.
This explains attraction to Frege and Russell. Russell also was
obviously
a realist in this first case.
And the logic is another aspect to approach metaphysics. I find it funny that many students and maybe even many colleagues think that, okay, logic is something abstract, detached from existential questions, detached from reality and from metaphysics, from ontological questions. I find it quite on the contrary. I think that if we can approach metaphysics really today, it is through logic. And actually existence is the first big question in logic, actually. It is what it is all about, the Barkham formula, I'm sorry. That is for me actually very clear.
Exist is to be a value of a bounded variable, right?
Yeah, that's one answer. I think that existence plays an important part. And if you define the existence in this or that manner in logic, you will get different logical systems. Paraconsistent logic has some way of defining existence. Classical logic completely with the other, and so on. So I think that those questions are quite a bit connected. And the newfound love of mine is philosophy of science, actually. So also metaphysical problems mostly related to empirical sciences, mostly physics. That's what I'm working now the most on. And I also connected with the history of philosophy, because there are some philosophers who, in my opinion, really made a gigantic breakthrough, certainly in modern periods. I think they're mostly of Leibniz, for example, Leibniz, Descartes probably, and so on. So I often go back to those authors, and that's where history of philosophy enters into the picture for me. I also taught history of philosophy. I'm teaching to students, so that's obviously I have to be in the matter. So that is my answer. I think that logic and mathematics are extremely important, extremely ontology guided. If you see the various approaches to mathematics from purely philosophical perspective, you will even get a different mathematics. Like intuitionistic mathematics looks completely different. It has different laws comparing to classical mathematics. And that depends on philosophical stance that you are actually adopting. So I think that if metaphysics is alive somewhere, it is in logic and mathematics. So I'm very much concerned with the reality by working on logic and philosophy of mathematics.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I share pretty much the same stance. And if you allow me and the
audience, ja bi imao na kraj уште нешто.
Da, okay. Then Ljubomir Gajdov, please ask your question. На македонски, српски, англиски, како сакате, повелете.
Ја ги знам сите јазици, ама македонски ми е најдраг. Дали на ваше додипломском студију у Белграду имате обавезан предмет математика?
Imamo, nije obavezan, izvinjavam se, na osnovnim studijama postoje 2 godine matematike, ali kao izborni predmet. Takođe postoji nekoliko kurseva filozofije matematike na različitim nivoima, i na diplomskom i na postdiplomskim kursevima, ali matematika nije obavezan predmet, jeste izborni predmet.
Evo zašto pitam. Ja, studirajući građevinu, polagao sam 4 matematike i mislim da je daleko od pameti da neko uči filozofiju matematike, a da ne prođe kurs barem jednog semestra takozvane više matematike.
Apsolutno.
Da se uče diferencijali, integralni račun, Riemannova algebra, Riemannova geometrija i tako dalje.
Ja se apsolutno slažem sa vama. Ja sam imala 4 semestra matematike na osnovnim studijama i na ispitu sam čak polagala, imala sam zadatak da dokažem Gödelovu teoremu nepotpunosti, što je vrlo teško pitanje. Ali postoji matematika. Naravno, ne može biti baš obavezan predmet, zato što nisu svi studenti na filozofiji orijentisani ka matematici, logici i tako dalje. Ima oni koji žele da se bave etikom, politikom, estetikom, drugim temama. Njima matematika verovatno nije od velike koristi, zato postoji i drugi izborni predmeti, ali mislim da je jako bitno za filozofe koji žele da se bave u krajnjoj liniji analitičkom filozofijom. Mislim da i tekako može da bude bitno.
Još jedno nezgodno pitanje. Govoreći o metafizici, ne znam da li ste prevideli da je Lavovsko-Varšavska škola apsolutno na stanovištu da je metafizika mrtva.
Tu se ne slažem sa vama. Barem Ajdukević nije bio na tom stanovištu. Znate, to je bilo više prisutno kod pozitivista, a u Bečkoj školi je postojala struja koja je potpuno odbacivala metafiziku. Lavovsko-Varšavska škola je bila benevolentnija prema metafizičkim pitanjima, a svakako Ajdukević. Sad može se reći da to zavisilo i od konkretnog filozofa, ali Ajdukević definitivno nije mislio da su metafizička pitanja mrtva. Naprotiv, on je tokom svog obimnog rada zapravo se bavio i Kantom i raznim suštinskim metafizičkim pitanjima i smatrao je da se na njih može odgovoriti. Mnoge filozofske dileme koje obično ostavljamo onako otvorene.
Ali bio je pod uticajem Poincaréa.
Poincaré je bio...
Da dovršim samo, a Poincaré je isto kontraverzna ličnost koja je polovina bio kantijanac, a polovina antikantijanac. To je.
Tako je, Poincaré je bio vrlo specifičan filozof nauke, ali pre svega matematičar, i to treba razumeti. On je bio filozof onako iz radoznalosti, možemo reći, pisao je puno o filozofiji nauke, metodologiji, ali je suštinski bio pre svega matematičar, ali Poincaré se nije naročito izjašnjavao po pitanju, sad i to je bilo možda i ranija, stvari, filozofija nije, da, slažem se sa vama, kad se radi o aritmetici bio je potpuno kantovac, sledio je Kantov intuicionizam u okviru aritmetike, borio se protiv logicista, protiv logicističke teze i tako dalje, a kad se radi o geometriji, tu je potpuno odbacio Kanta i argumentovao protiv Kanta. Smatrao je da geometrija i aritmetika su dve sasvim različite oblasti. To je smatrao i Frege. Frege je smatrao da je aritmetika u potpunosti analitička, a da je geometrija sintetička. Dakle, on je smatrao takođe da postoji razlika između ta dva. Russell je smatrao da ne, obje su analitičke, to je dalje Russellov doprinos.
Да, благодарам многу. Дали имаме други прашања од публиката? Ако нема, јас сакам да искористам оваа можност, расположеноста на Радмила да комуницира со нас и вака да добиеме стручни експертски одговори на многу прашања поврзани со логиката и сродните подрачја. Едно питање бих хотела, ако може још мало, као коментар, као неко споделјување твоје перцепција. Обзиром да е, ако се не варам, твој коментор био професор Шаид Раман, јел да? Професор логике у Лилу и светски познат логичар, кој е измеѓу осталог веома познат по едном систему некласичних такозвани логика која развија, диалошка логика. Оно што ми е било јако интересантно, то е још Лоренцен и Лоренц тај правац развили, али мислим да е професор Раман са неговим сурадницима Лорен Киф, ако се не варам, и други чланови те njihove škole razvili ideja tog dijaloškog interpretiranja značenja osnovnih logičkih konstanti, konjunkcije, disjunkcije, implikacije i tako dalje, kao pravila za vođenje dijaloga. I da je taj pragmatički pristup logici u onom smislu u koji se logika u stvari vezuje sa praktikom dijalogiziranja i vođenja rasprave, znači ta dijaloška interpretacija osnovnih logičkih konstanti, po meni je jako interesantna pozicija koja na neki način, kao što smo diskutirali i u Lilu, povezuje logiku i dijalektiku. Na neki način pokazuje tu dijalektičku tradiciju kao rodno mesto logika, afirmiše tu ideju. Pa eto tako, interesuje me kakvo je tvoje mišljenje, da li radeći sa Šaidom si eto tako si imala priliku da više tu dijalošku perspektivu razviješ, da li knjizi o Hintici i njegovom pristupu realizmu i konstruktivizmu, da li je i ta perspektiva na neki način integrisana? Hvala.
Jeste, hvala ti na ovom pitanju. Pa da, za rad sa Šaidom je svakako bio od neprocenjivog značaja za mene. To je jedan vrlo specijalan čovek, neverovatan stručnjak, ali i neverovatan čovek ovako. Moram da ti ispravim malo, dijaloška logika nije neklasična logika. To je jedan specifičan sistem dokazivanja teorema, koji je ekvivalentan drugim takvim načinima dokazivanja poput Gencenovog ili računa sekvenata i tako dalje. Može se primijeniti na bilo koju logiku. Dakle, klasična logika se može raditi kroz teoreme klasične logike, mogu se dokazivati dijaloški.
I na dijaloški način, da.
Tako je. Dijaloški metod ima negde izvor u teoriji igara, ako hoćete. Ideja jeste da se teoreme dokazuju kroz dijalog između dva igrača, ako hoćete, od kojih jedan brani tezu, a drugi pokušava da je pobije. Tako da ukoliko se dođe do protivrečnosti, recimo, kao i obično, dakle, počinjemo od negacije teze koju želimo da dokažemo, ako dođemo do protivrečnosti kroz dijalog, onda smo dokazali inicijalnu tezu i tako dalje. Naravno, ovaj pristup daje novu interpretaciju, kao što si rekla, disjunkciju, konjunkciji, veznicima, operatorima i tako dalje. Šajdova ideja, i to je ono što on često ponavlja, jeste da je još Aristotel nekako razdvojio logiku od retorike. Pa dijalog spada u retoriku, dok logika je silogizam i nešto sasvim drugo. On svojim sistemom, svojim pristupom pokušava da vrati ta dva zajedno. Da se može teorija dokaza izvoditi kroz dijalog između dve strane. Takođe se mogu praviti i materijalni dijalozi u kojima se radi o istini, a ne validnosti, pa se tu približavamo teoriji modela. Možemo reći da je ovaj pristup bliži teoriji dokaza, ali jeste negde između teorije modela i klasične teorije dokaza. Ima razne prednosti taj pristup dokazivanju. Između ostalog, to jeste komplikovaniji način, dakle imaće uvek više koraka nego u drugim sistemima dokazivanja, ali zato je dosta transparentniji i može se jako bolje vidjeti konekcije između različitih teza, šta od čega logički zavisi. Za studente je jako zanimljivo, stvari za učenje je jako pozitivno. Ja sam koristila dijaloški metod u svojoj tezi doktorskoj, tako što sam pokazivala, sad ja sam kritikovala Hintikin pristup. Hintika takođe se bavi logikom kroz teoriju igara i on je osmislio svoj sopstveni sistem teorije igara koju on koristi. Ja sam htjela da pokažem da sve što se može dokazati njegovim metodom se može bolje dokazati ovim drugim metodom, s tim što sam ja kombinovala dijaloški metod sa pristupom per Martina L.F. i to sam koristila protiv Hintike, da pokažem da na taj način može bolje i malo više, može sve isto i još malo više. To je bila moja primjena dijaloškog metoda, ali da, mislim da je zapravo jako plodan. I ti si upravo, Lorencen i Lorenz su to 50-ih započeli, ali pravi proboj je napravio Šajt sa svojom grupom logičkom. Tu su Loren Keff, Mathieu Fontaine, mnogi drugi, sad da ne nabrajam sva imena.
Dobro, hvala.
Ana, ne čujemo.
Da. Druga pitanja da li imamo? Ok. Ako ja ne vidim kod mene na ekranu prijave za diskusiju, onda željela bih da najsrdačnije zahvalim Radmili zato što je ljubazno prihvatila ovu ponudu da ovako radno obeležimo Svetski dan.
Ja se vama mnogo zahvaljujem na poziv. Zaista mi je bilo zadovoljstvo.
I da je čestitaš staru novu godinu.
Čestitam staru novu godinu i naročito zahvaljujem svim našim članovima auditorijuma koji su i danom i ovim neradnim danom, da u subotu bili voljni da spodele svoje vreme i svoj entuzijazam, da imamo ovu plodnu diskusiju na ovoj temi koja je prividno možda ezoterična, ali u suštini, kao što je i Radmila rekla, jako tesno povezana sa svim temeljnim filozofskim pitanjima. Onda želim vam ugodan dan i Radmili i svima vama i nadam se da ćemo imati još ovakvih prilika za zajedničko promišljanje, diskusiju i u ovakvom virtualnom formatu, a zašto da ne uskoro i u realnom formatu, da Belgrad nije daleko, pa čak ni Varšava nije.
I Ohrid nije daleko.
Tako je, nadam se.
Također se nadam, Ana, hvala mnogo i hvala svima u publici, hvala na pitanjima i hvala što ste slušali.
Da, doviđenja i vidimo se.
Prijetno, doviđenja.
Ćao.